Hey friends, tonight we are slipping back into the mists of pre-dynastic China with lots of insights and knowledge. A time so old it barely had years. When emperors weren't yet emperors, dragons were metaphors without marketing campaigns, and nobody had invented chopsticks or bureaucracy. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, loosen your grip on the day, and let's drift together into a time so ancient that history itself was still dozing. Ready? Let's begin. Around 5,000 ago, somewhere between legend and maybe, there lived people. Not emperors, not generals, just people. People who built their homes out of mud and reeds, who fished in gentle rivers that didn't yet have names printed on maps, who looked up at the moon and said, "That's nice," and then went back to grinding millet. We call this Neolithic China, but they didn't call it anything. They were too busy not being cold. Some of these early folks lived in the Yangshuo culture. If that name sounds familiar, it shouldn't. They didn't write things down. But archaeologists love them because they left behind adorable red pottery, sometimes decorated with fish. Why fish? Because fish were food. And also, they had a kind of gentle symmetry if you squinted. These people farmed, sort of. They domesticated millet, which is like rice if you remove the excitement. Millet grew well in the Loess Plateau, a place where the wind blew dirt so fine and yellow that even the sunsets looked powdered. Their homes were dug into the ground for insulation, which sounds practical unless it rained. Then it sounded like regret. Now, over in the east, along the coast, another group was quietly inventing the idea of minding their own business. This was the Hemidu culture, and unlike the Yangshuo, they liked rice. They lived on stilt houses, probably to avoid floods and very determined frogs. They built wooden tools, wore clothes made of bark, which sounds itchy, and worshipped spirits that probably didn't have Instagram accounts. And yet, even without writing, battles, or bronze, these cultures laid the quiet groundwork for everything to come. It's like the opening credits to a very long, very dramatic show. No emperors, no walls, just woven baskets, silent rivers, and a lot of very determined agriculture. But of course, things wouldn't stay quiet forever. Enter the Longshan culture, or, as archaeologists like to call them, those people who figured out how to be just a little intimidating. They made black pottery, glossy, elegant, and very dramatic. It looked like the kind of bowl that could hold soup or secrets. They also started building walls, small ones, village-sized, the kind of wall that says, "We're peaceful, but just in case." And while the Longshan didn't write anything down, they may have started scratching symbols on bones. Not yet characters, but hints, echoes. The idea of writing stirring like a sleepy dragon. Now, while the villages were getting bigger and the bowls were getting shinier, people started dying more dramatically. Burial pits suggest hierarchy. Some got jade, others got dirt. And so, class arrived. Not with a trumpet, but with a slightly better grave. Meanwhile, over in the misty corners of myth, people began whispering about the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors. Were they real? That depends on your definition of real. They existed in stories, in scrolls, written thousands of years later by scholars with calligraphy so neat it probably frightened their children. These legendary rulers were said to be wise, divine, and very into inventing things. One created fire, another invented farming. One of them, the Yellow Emperor, apparently invented clothing, government, medicine, and warfare. which is a lot for one guy, but he probably had good time management. The Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi, was the star of many tales. He was said to have battled monsters, taught people how to build homes, and eventually ascended to heaven on a dragon. Whether or not any of this happened doesn't matter. What matters is that people believed it could, and belief, as you'll soon see, is the foundation of civilization. That, and grain taxes, by the time we inch closer to the Shire dynasty, a name that dances awkwardly between archaeology and legend. The fog of history starts to thin, not disappear, just thin. We think the Shire ruled sometime around 2100 BCE. We think they were centered in the Yellow River Valley. We think they liked bronze, rice, and long walks on the floodplain. The Shire were said to be founded by you, the Great, a man who didn't fight wars or marry a goddess. No, you earned his fame by fighting floods. For years, he dredged canals, built levees, and probably didn't smile much. But he became emperor not because he conquered a city, but because he managed water, which tells you a lot about China's priorities. He's remembered as the man who turned chaos into order, who tamed the wild rivers so people could plant, harvest, and occasionally argue about fence lines. He's also credited with founding the hereditary monarchy, which was great for dynasties, and terrible for everyone who wasn't born into one. But we haven't found enough hard evidence to confirm the Shire dynasty really existed. Maybe it did. Maybe it was a memory stitched together by later scribes. Maybe it's both. That's the thing about ancient China. It's part history, part myth, and part beautifully written guesswork. Still, something happened. Cities rose, pottery improved, tools sharpened. People began to organize, not just by family, but by power. Some gave orders, others gave taxes. Civilization, that awkward teenager, had arrived, and with it, the first hints of something enormous. Because just beyond the Shire, waiting in the shadows with bells, bronze, and an impressive ability to write on turtle shells, was the Shang dynasty. It's somewhere around 1600 BCE, give or take a war. The Shang dynasty has just taken the stage, kicking out the ghost of the maybe Shah and declaring themselves the real deal. Unlike the hazy myths before them, the Shang left us something solid, writing, not novels, not grocery lists, but oracle bones, tortoise shells and ox scapulae etched with questions for the divine. It's history's first magic 8-ball. Except it involved fire and a lot more reverence. Here's how it worked. The king, usually wearing something elaborate and impractical, would ask a question like, will it rain next week? Or is it okay if I sacrifice 18 people? Then a diviner, basically an ancient PR manager for the ancestors, would carve the question into the bone, heat it until it cracked, and interpret the resulting lines as divine answers. Sometimes the answers were good, sometimes they were ominous, but either way the bones were saved, carefully, lovingly, buried like little burned secrets in what is now modern Henan province. Thanks to these fragments, we know more about the Shang than any earlier Chinese civilization. We also know they were a little obsessed with two things, bronze and ancestors. Let's talk bronze. If the Neolithic era was the age of mud, this was the age of metal. Shang bronzes weren't just practical, they were powerful. Enormous ritual vessels shaped like monsters, wine cups that looked like they could scream, and weapons with blade edges sharper than some modern relationships. These weren't mass-produced soup bowls. They were status symbols, cast in clay molds, with dragons etched into every surface, then used in ceremonies that combined spirituality, politics, and a splash of intimidation. The bronze was controlled by the elite, and that meant controlling everything from war to religion to dinner. You see, Shang society was built like a very stern pyramid. At the top was the king, below him nobles, then artisans, then farmers, and at the bottom slaves, many of whom didn't have long resumes, just short futures. And the king wasn't just a ruler. He was the chief priest, the hotline between the living and the dead. He wasn't asking the gods for favors. He was checking the family group chat. Because, in Shang cosmology, dead ancestors weren't gone. They were backstage, watching, judging, and occasionally throwing metaphorical lightning bolts if they weren't properly fed. What do you feed a dead ancestor? Wine, meat, sometimes bronze soup, and sometimes people. Yes, human sacrifice was a thing. Not every Tuesday, but enough to keep you from sleeping near the temple. Captured enemies, slaves, sometimes even loyal followers, all were offered to the spirits during major ceremonies. These sacrifices weren't seen as cruel, they were sacred. A necessary transaction in a world where the dead held influence over crops, rain, and royal reputations. But if you were lucky, and not on the chopping block, you might be an artisan, the unsung genius of the Shang world. You'd carve jade so delicate it looked like frozen smoke, shape bronze with terrifying precision, or even create musical instruments that sang to the ancestors. The Shang loved music, bells, drums, chimes, not for concerts, but for rituals. Every note had a purpose, a vibration meant to echo between worlds. Music wasn't entertainment, it was communication. Meanwhile, the farmers, most of the population, toiled in the shadows of this divine drama. They planted millet, rice, wheat. They raised pigs and chickens and children. Their job was to keep the granaries full and the ancestors pleased. They probably didn't get a lot of thanks, or bronze soup. Now, let's talk cities. The Shang capital, Yin, was no sleepy hamlet. It had palaces, temples, workshops, and something resembling urban planning. Archaeologists found a treasure trove there, oracle bones, giant tombs, and enough bronze vessels to start an apocalyptic tea party. One of the most remarkable discoveries, the tomb of Fu Hao, a military general, high priestess, and royal consort all in one. Her tomb contained weapons, treasures, sacrificial victims, and her own story carved into history. She wasn't just powerful, she was respected, which is impressive, considering most women at the time weren't even invited to the ancestor table. So things were going well. The Shang were powerful, their rituals complex, their art dazzling, their kings terrifying. But dynasties have a habit of overreaching. The later Shang kings, not great Yelp reviews. One in particular, King Di Xin, went full tyrant mode. His reign was marked by cruelty, indulgence, and what ancient historians describe as debauchery, which probably meant wine, bad decisions, and a giant pool of meat. Yes, there are tales of him filling a pond with wine and hanging meat in trees, a barbecue of nightmares. Eventually, the people had enough, or more accurately, the neighboring Zhou clan did. But we're not there yet. For now, the Shang still reign. Bronze bells still chime. The king still talks to his turtle shells. And somewhere in a quiet village, a farmer raises his head and wonders if anyone will remember his name. They won't, but they will remember the dynasty he lived under. The one that turned bones into books and bronze into power. So rest easy, sleepy scholar. The Shang dynasty may be filled with ghosts, rituals, and just a little blood, but it's also where Chinese history begins to speak, in symbols, in songs, in the careful, crackling lines of fire and bone. The fall of the Shang wasn't a crash. It was more like a controlled demolition, guided gently by a rival who had been waiting very, very patiently. That rival was the Zhou, a tribe from the western frontier, who claimed not just ambition, but moral superiority and a divine reason for action. Enter the mandate of heaven, a concept so tidy, so convenient, that it would end up justifying almost every major power shift in Chinese history for the next 3,000 years. The idea was simple. Heaven, the cosmos, fate, the moral order of everything, chooses who gets to rule. But heaven is fickle. If a ruler becomes unjust, corrupt, or forgets to change the incense on his ancestor altar, well, heaven takes back the mandate and gives it to someone else. That someone else, right now, was the Zhou, led by King Wu. The Zhou overthrew the last Shang ruler, Di Xin, who had apparently become so disinterested in his duties and so interested in his wine lake that he forgot ruling was a job. The Zhou swooped in, declared the Shang unworthy, and started handing out land like polite warlords with a great marketing department. Unlike the Shang, the Zhou didn't want to concentrate everything in a central capital. Instead, they built a system of feudalism, yes, the same kind of setup Europe would later enjoy, complete with lords, vassals, and complicated family trees. Land was handed to relatives and loyal followers, who ruled over smaller territories in the king's name. In theory, it was orderly. In practice, it was like herding cats with swords. Still, the early Zhou, what historians call the Western Zhou, had their act together. They expanded agriculture, improved irrigation, and promoted rituals that were both elegant and exhausting. Society became layered and structured, kings at the top, nobles next, then farmers, artisans, and merchants, each with their role, their dress code, and a growing sense of where they didn't belong. The Zhou elite were obsessed with ritual and hierarchy. Everything had a proper way: how to bow, how to mourn, how to offer meat to your ancestors without offending them or the local priest. Books like the Book of Rites and the Book of Documents weren't just read, they were performed, lived, memorized by generations of scholars who would later spend entire lives writing commentaries about the commentaries. And yet, for all their order and sacred duty, the Zhou had a flaw. They had invented a system that worked beautifully right up until people stopped cooperating. By around 770 BCE, things began to crack. One Zhou king made the classic mistake of ignoring his nobles, his advisors, and his wife, all to impress a concubine with a really dry sense of humor. To make her laugh, he faked an invasion by lighting the emergency beacons, giant fires meant to summon his allied armies. When the troops arrived to find no enemy and just an awkward palace party, they weren't amused. The next time there was a real invasion, nobody came. That was the end of the Western Zhou. The court fled eastward. The dynasty survived, barely. And what followed was an era known to history as the Eastern Zhou. It would last longer than the Western Zhou, but it would never be whole again. Instead, China began to break apart, not with chaos, but with decentralized ambition. Local lords became regional kings. Their lands grew more independent. Armies became larger, more professional, and less interested in pretending they still answered to the Zhou king, who now spent most of his time performing rituals and being politely ignored. And yet, strangely, this period of fragmentation, this long stretch of slow collapse, would also become one of the most brilliant eras in Chinese thought. This was the spring and autumn period, named not for the weather, but for a chronicle written by generations, of scribes trying to make sense of noble alliances, assassinations, betrayals, and dinners that ended with poison instead of dessert. Over the next few centuries, hundreds of states jostled for power. Some lasted decades, others only a handful of seasons. Among them were names that would echo into legend: Qi, Jin, Lu, Ku, and Qin. A name we'll come back to later with a much louder bang. Despite the turbulence, this era wasn't all swords and scheming. It was also the golden age of ideas. Because when order breaks down, thought steps in. People started asking questions. What is virtue? What is justice? What is the right way to rule? The answers, and there were many, would define Chinese civilization. One man in particular had some very confident thoughts on the matter. His name was Confucius, better known to us as Confucius. Born in the state of Lu in 551 BCE, Confucius didn't invent virtue, but he did organize it into a very neat and demanding system. To him, society worked best when everyone knew their role and performed it with sincerity, discipline, and respect. He believed in filial piety, hituo, decorum, and the power of leading by moral example. A ruler, Confucius said, should be like a father, not a tyrant whose goodness inspires obedience. Families were the model for the state, and harmony came from each person doing what they ought to, even if they didn't want to. His students gathered his sayings into a book called the Analects, a collection of conversations, teachings, and occasional grumpy remarks about politics and bad music. Confucius never held high office for long, but his ideas would survive for centuries, shaping empires, exams, and the mental health of many overworked scholars. But he wasn't alone. Other philosophies rose too. Some, like Mohism, preached universal love, not the romantic kind, but the radically equitable kind that saw everyone as deserving of care, regardless of status or family ties. Others, like legalism, had a far darker view. They believed people were fundamentally selfish, and only strict laws and harsh punishments could maintain order. Then there was Taoism, which floated in like a cloud and asked, what if we just didn't? Taoism taught harmony with nature, simplicity, and letting go. It was the opposite of Confucian duty, where Confucius said, study, a Taoist might say nap. Where the legalists said punish, the Taoists would probably light incense and stare at a waterfall. These schools of thought didn't always agree, but together they formed the philosophical backbone of Chinese civilization. Not through conquest, but through conversation, through scrolls, debate, and the quiet power of ideas scribbled in bamboo slips and tied together with string. Meanwhile, back in the world of armies and annexations, the Zhou dynasty continued to fade. Its kings still held ceremonies, still prayed to ancestors, still technically ruled. But by the 5th century BCE, they were ceremonial shadows, while real power passed into the hands of the strongest surviving states. And now, those states were growing teeth. What began as the spring and autumn period would now evolve into something even more intense. A time when diplomacy was replaced by steel, and survival required more than clever speeches or polished rituals. This next phase of China's story would be called the Warring States period. 7 major kingdoms, dozens of armies, new weapons, new strategies, new dreams of unification, but all of that, all the blood and iron and empire, still lies ahead. The warring states period wasn't named for its subtlety. It was a time when the map of China fractured into jagged pieces, each one ruled by a king who believed he should be the only one left standing. The Zhou king still existed, technically. He still conducted ceremonies and lit the incense and offered the wine, but by now, his voice barely reached beyond his own courtyard. The true power lay in 7 kingdoms: Qi, Kachu, Yan, Han, Zhao Wei, and Qinich, sharpening its blades, its laws, and its ambitions. Warfare changed. It wasn't the small-scale noble dueling of earlier eras. This was total war. Battles involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Cavalry emerged as a game-changer. Chariots faded, and iron replaced bronze. Crossbows were refined to fire with deadly speed and terrible accuracy. Strategies became more complex. Fortifications grew taller. Spies, deception, and cold-blooded calculation became the new currency of power. States adopted the cold efficiency of legalism. Unlike Confucianism's moral high ground, legalism assumed people were inherently selfish. Therefore, the only way to keep order was through strict laws, enforced without mercy. Rewards for obedience, punishments for disobedience. And not just for you, often for your entire family. This wasn't just governance. It was behavioral engineering. Among all these states, one stood out not because it was more righteous or more cultured, but because it was ruthlessly effective. The state of Qin, once a marginal frontier power from the West, began to transform itself into a war machine. At its core was the legalist reformer Shang Yang, who implemented policies that made the Qin state terrifyingly efficient. Land was redistributed to encourage farming and military service. Nobles lost their privileges unless they performed well in battle. Merit, not birth, became the measure of advancement. Qin's soldiers were hardened. Their officers knew their roles. Their people were drilled to obey. Other states still balanced tradition with innovation. Qin chose innovation, discipline, and fear, and it worked. While the battles raged, the thinkers kept writing. Han Fizi, a legalist philosopher and former student of Confucianism, laid out his vision for a government run not on virtue or wisdom, but on impersonal rules, enforced by institutions too powerful to challenge. His writings would later become the blueprint for the rise of imperial China, not soft, not sentimental, but enduring. Meanwhile, internal reforms swept other states as well. The kingdom of Su, once seen as exotic and culturally distinct, began to modernize. Qi developed strong economic systems and became a center for learning and philosophy. Zhao adopted cavalry tactics from steppe nomads, turning the northern border into a proving ground for military innovation. But all of it, every reform, every scroll, every sharpened blade led to one thing: the slow, grinding consolidation of power. One by one, the smaller kingdoms fell. Some through conquest, others through clever manipulation. Alliances formed, broke, reformed, and dissolved. The Qin continued to press eastward. No one liked them. Everyone feared them, but no one could stop them. In the year 256 BCE, the last Zhou king died. There was no real ceremony, no dramatic curtain close, just a quiet end to a dynasty that had ruled in name for 8 centuries. The Zhou were gone, and no one really noticed. By now, the final contenders were clear. The remaining kingdoms had narrowed down. But there was only one state whose machinery was running at full speed, whose leaders tolerated no dissent, whose army was a juggernaut, Qin. And within Qin, a young king was rising. His name was Yingzhang. He ascended the throne at 13. At first, regents ruled in his name, but not for long. He was sharp, intense, and completely uninterested in sharing power. Under his leadership, Qin finished what it had started. In 230 BCE, Qin invaded Han, then Shao, then Yan, then Wei, then Xiao, then Qi. Each conquest was swift, brutal, and final. The Qin army didn't just win, they annihilated resistance, demolished city walls, burned histories, and forced thousands into labor to build the infrastructure of their rising empire. By 221 BCE, for the first time in recorded history, the lands of what we now call China were united under a single ruler. Yingzheng gave himself a new title. Not king, not duke, but something that had never existed before. He became Qin Shi Huang, first emperor of Qin. It wasn't a modest name, it wasn't meant to be. He claimed not just political dominance, but cosmic legitimacy. He wasn't just a man, he was an institution, a divinely sanctioned force. And he was going to make sure China never fractured again. His empire was a machine, centralized, standardized, surveilled. Weights and measures were unified. Currencies, writing systems, axle lengths for carts, everything was made the same. Roads were built, canals dug. The walls of earlier northern defenses were linked together into what would later be romanticized as the Great Wall, though at this point it was less scenic and more of a brutal project that buried laborers where they fell. Qin Shi Huang also ordered the burning of books and the execution of scholars who criticized him. History, to him, was a tool to shape, not a record to honor. He was determined to prevent dissent not through debate, but through obliteration. But even he couldn't control the one force he feared most, death. Obsessed with immortality, he sent expeditions in search of magical islands, rare herbs, and alchemical formulas. None worked. He grew increasingly paranoid, isolating himself from court, hiding his movements, and consuming mercury pills that ironically hastened his decline. And yet, he left behind something extraordinary outside the modern city of Xi'an. Archaeologists uncovered a vast field of clay, warriors life-sized, each with distinct features, guarding his mausoleum. The terracotta army, standing silently in formation, protecting a tomb that remains sealed even now. A city beneath the earth, built for a man who could not bear to let go. The first emperor died in 210 BCE, his body hidden in a carriage to prevent unrest during the journey home. But unrest came anyway. His son couldn't hold the empire together. Rebellions broke out, and within just a few years, the Qin dynasty collapsed, short-lived yet seismic. But the idea of empire, unified, centralized, eternal, had taken root, and a new dynasty was already forming in the distance. One that would learn from Qin's brutality, temper it with Confucian values, and stretch its influence across continents and centuries. The Han dynasty was waiting, and with it, China would begin its journey into something far greater than unification. The making of a civilization that saw itself as the center of the world. The Qin dynasty had united China, but it had done so with such unrelenting force that the moment its founding emperor died, the whole structure cracked. Rebellions broke out across the land. The empire that had conquered 6 kingdoms in under a decade unraveled in just a few years. Amid the chaos rose a man from humble beginnings, His name was Liu Bang, a former peasant, minor official, and occasional fugitive. He had no noble lineage, no grand temple bloodline, and no philosophical school backing his cause. What he did have was an ability to read the political winds, a knack for not getting killed. He joined the rebellion against the Qin, aligned with more powerful warlords, and slowly maneuvered himself into the right place at the right time. His greatest rival was Shang Yu, a brilliant but ruthless nobleman with deep connections and an army to match. For a while, it seemed Shang Yu would claim the empire. He was stronger, more charismatic, and better trained. But Liu Bang was patient. While Shang Yu burned the Qin capital and alienated allies with cruelty, Liu Bang offered peace, relief, and tax cuts. And when the two finally clashed in battle, it was Liu Bang who stood victorious. By 202 BCE, Liu Bang had declared himself Emperor Gaozu of Han. The Han dynasty was born not in the glitter of conquest, but in the quiet triumph of calculated compromise. Gaozu ruled with a lighter hand than the Qin. He kept the administrative structure, but scrapped the harsher legalist doctrines. Instead, he turned to a softer approach, Confucianism. Not at first, Gaozu was a practical man who didn't much care for philosophy. But later, rulers would adopt Confucian ideals as the moral framework of the empire. Over the next 4 centuries, the Han dynasty would expand, innovate, and entrench ideas that defined what it meant to be Chinese. The early Han rulers, known as the Western Han, governed from Chang'an, a city that would become the heart of the empire. Gaozu and his immediate successors worked to stabilize the state-rebuilding infrastructure, reforming tax systems and encouraging agriculture. Nobles who had helped in the rebellion were given lands but watched carefully. Power was centralized. Again, though with more velvet and fewer chains. Then came Emperor Wu, or Han Wudi, who reigned from 141 to 87 BCE. He was ambitious, brilliant, and absolutely uninterested in keeping things quiet. Han Wudi made Confucianism the official state philosophy, not just a set of ideas, but the ideology of governance. A bureaucracy of educated scholars emerged, tested in their knowledge of ancient texts and moral rectitude. The emperor was now a cosmic figure, son of heaven, responsible for maintaining harmony between earth and sky. Government became not just administration, but ritualized virtue in action. But Wudi wasn't just interested in virtue, he was interested in expansion. Under his reign, the Han Empire pushed its borders far beyond the Yellow River Basin. Military campaigns stretched into modern-day Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia. His generals fought the Zhongnu, nomadic horse riders from the north who had long raided Chinese frontiers. These battles weren't easy. The Zhongnu were fast, mobile, and knew the land. But eventually, treaties were signed, tributes exchanged, and border fortifications strengthened. It wasn't just about defense. Wudi was after trade routes, and one in particular was of special interest, the corridor to the west that would become known as the Silk Road. Though it wouldn't be called that for centuries, the Silk Road began to emerge as a web of caravan routes stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Through it flowed silk, yes, but also spices, jade, horses, gold, and more importantly, Buddhism began its slow crawl into China through these paths. So did foreign art, astronomy, and strange rumors of lands where people rode sideways and bathed in oils. Back home, the Han court grew more intricate. Palaces multiplied. Eunuchs gained influence. Emperors became increasingly isolated behind. layers of advisors and etiquette. Meanwhile, the civil service examination system began to take shape. While not yet the full-scale testing empire it would later become, the idea was clear: rule by those who had earned their positions through learning, not birth. The Han dynasty became a cultural force. Poetry flourished. Historians began compiling comprehensive records of the past. Sima Qian, the great court historian, wrote the records of the Grand Historian, a work so influential that later dynasties would imitate its structure for centuries. Inventions and discoveries abounded. Paper began replacing bamboo strips. Iron tools improved farming. Seismographs, suspension bridges, acupuncture all emerged or matured under the Han. The empire became not just powerful, but proud. But even the strongest dynasties strain over time. As emperors weakened, court intrigues multiplied. Powerful families, eunuchs, and empresses began to dominate the court. Child emperors were installed, manipulated, and often discarded. The once smooth machinery of governance jammed with corruption, inefficiency, and paranoia. Meanwhile, on the land, landowners grew rich, while peasants fell into debt. Tax burdens fell unevenly. Rebellions flickered in the countryside like brush fires, easily stamped out at first, but gradually harder to contain. In 09 CE, a man named Wang Mang, a scholar official and regent, declared the Han mandate had ended and started his own dynasty, the Xin dynasty. He tried radical reforms: land redistribution, currency changes, bans on slavery. Many of the ideas were ahead of their time. Almost all of them failed. The empire fell into chaos. Famine, floods, and rebellion toppled Wang Mang, and by 23 CE, the Han were restored under a new line of rulers, now based in Luoyang. This period, called the Eastern Han, tried to recapture past glories. For a time, it succeeded. Trade resumed, arts continued, the bureaucracy was rebuilt, but the cracks remained. By the 2nd century, powerful clans dominated court politics. Eunuchs fought, with scholar officials for influence. Rural poverty deepened. The Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE, a massive uprising driven by millenarian religious fervor, signaled the start of the end. Armies were raised not by the emperor, but by generals, and once generals have armies, emperors become suggestions. The Eastern Han staggered through the final decades, held together by inertia and ceremony. Real power passed to military governors and warlords. In 220 CE, the last Han emperor abdicated, and the empire split into pieces once more. China had known unity. It had tasted the structure of empire, the rhythm of bureaucracy, the dream of cultural harmony. But now, it would descend into one of its most romanticized and chaotic periods, the Three Kingdoms. The Han was over. When the Han dynasty finally collapsed, it didn't go quietly. It shattered into 3 competing regimes, each claiming legitimacy, each ruled by men with ambitions too large for a divided world. This was the Three Kingdoms period, an era of civil war, fractured loyalties, and legendary figures whose names would echo in folklore, novels, operas, and late-night history debates for centuries. The 3 major powers were Wei, Shu, and Wu. Wei, in the north, was the most powerful. Founded by Cao Cao, a brilliant and ruthless warlord, Wei held the remnants of the Han bureaucracy and the most territory. Cao Cao wasn't emperor. He preferred control without ceremony, but his son, Cao Pai, would formally end the Han by forcing the last emperor to abdicate in 220 CE and declaring himself the Emperor of Wei to the southwest. Shu was ruled by Liu Bei, a man of humble birth who claimed distant ties to the Han royal family. Liu Bei was known for his loyalty, charisma, and tendency to weep dramatically in public. He surrounded himself with legendary figures: Zhuge Liang, the brilliant strategist, an inventor of mechanical wonders; Guan Yu, the red-faced general later deified as the god of war; and Zhong Fei, a hot-tempered warrior with a love of wine and threats. In the southeast, the kingdom of Wu was established by Sun Quan, whose family had ruled the region for generations. Wu's navy dominated the Yangtze River, giving it a defensive edge and a relatively stable economy. Sun Quan was pragmatic, patient, and less prone to theatrical speeches than his rivals. The Three Kingdoms era was marked by constant shifting alliances, betrayals, and famous battles, none more iconic than the Battle of Red Cliffs. It took place around 208 CE, when Cao Cao marched south with a massive army to crush Liu Bei and Sun Quan. Vast fleets lined the Yangtze. The Southern Alliance, vastly outnumbered, set Cao Cao's ships ablaze with a carefully timed fire attack. Exploiting his unfamiliarity with naval warfare, the river turned to smoke and flames. Cao Cao retreated in humiliation. It was a moment that preserved the south and gave Shu and Wu space to survive. But survival was all it was. No kingdom ever managed to conquer the others completely. Instead, the wars dragged on for decades, draining resources, fracturing loyalty, and exhausting the people. Over time, the momentum shifted back north. Wei, with its superior infrastructure and military discipline, gradually asserted dominance. But internal struggles and regency squabbles weakened it from within. In 265 CE, a Wei general named Sima Yan seized power, forced the last Wei emperor to step down, and declared a new dynasty. The Jin dynasty. Jin would go on to conquer Shu, then Wu. By 280 CE, China was briefly unified again, but the victory was fragile. The Jin state was bloated, riddled with factionalism, and unable to hold the center. No sooner had the empire been stitched back together than it began to fray once more. The 4th century saw waves of disaster, plagues, famines, and infighting tore through the north. Power passed among court cliques and child emperors. Then came the invasion. From the steppes and deserts beyond the Great Wall came wave after wave of nomadic tribes, Xianbei, Jijiqiangyi, many of whom had been living on China's borders for centuries. Some had adopted Chinese customs. Others kept their own languages, horses, and leadership structures. As Jin authority collapsed, these groups moved in not as raiders, but as would-be rulers. The capital of Luoyang was sacked in 311 CE. The next capital, Chang'an, fell in 316 CE. The Jin court fled south, across the Yangtze, setting up a shadow government in Jiankang, modern-day Nanjing. This era is known as the Eastern Jin, but it ruled only the south. The north fragmented into dozens of states, some Chinese, some non-Han, all competing for dominance. Historians call this the 16 Kingdoms period, though the number is more poetic than precise. In reality, it was a dizzying time of rising and falling warlords, nomadic dynasties, and very short-lived emperors. The south, under Eastern Jin, became a haven for displaced elites. Refugees streamed across the river, bringing art, literature, and Confucian tradition. There was a flowering of culture, especially poetry and painting, but it lived in the shadow of political fragility. Generals wielded more power than emperors. Eunuchs and court officials fought proxy wars. Even within this oasis of stability, rebellion simmered. The North, meanwhile, entered a cycle of collapse and consolidation. The nomadic Shanbai, in particular, began to rise. Their leaders adopted Chinese-style administration, promoted agriculture, and increasingly intermarried with Han families. One Shanba-led state, Northern Wei, would go on to create a remarkably durable regime, fusing steppe traditions with Chinese governance. It was also during this chaotic period that Buddhism began to truly root itself in Chinese soil. Traders and monks had carried Buddhist texts along the Silk Road during the Han. But now, as the Confucian order crumbled, Buddhism offered something different: hope beyond the grave, structure amid uncertainty, and a cosmology that transcended the political failures of emperors and ministers. Caves were carved into cliffs and mountains. Monks translated Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. Pilgrims like Faxian journeyed to India to seek original scriptures. Buddhist statues multiplied, first serene, then monumental. By the 5th century, entire regions were governed by Buddhist law codes. Temples became both spiritual centers and economic hubs. The fusion of native Chinese philosophy with Buddhist doctrine sparked new schools of thought. Taoist mysticism blended with Buddhist metaphysics. The rigid ancestor worship of Confucianism softened in the glow of karma and reincarnation. It was a time of profound transformation, not just politically, but spiritually. And yet, China remained divided. The Northern and Southern dynasties period, which followed the 16 kingdoms, entrenched the geographic split. Northern dynasties, often founded by Nenhan elites, emphasized military strength, land reform, and frontier expansion. Southern dynasties, more culturally conservative, clung to the legacy of the Han, even as court intrigue undermined their stability. Still, change was coming. A warrior emperor would rise from the northern steppes. His dynasty would unify the north through reforms so sweeping that they would change the language, the legal code, and even the clothing of the ruling class. The south, weakened by infighting, would be absorbed into a newly forged empire under a new name. That name was Sui. And with it, China would march united again into a new era of grand canals, brutal building projects, and one of the most magnificent dynasties the world has ever known. The Temp's reunification came not with peace, but with steel and ambition. The North had long been consolidating under powerful dynasties, led by the Shunbai and other non-Han elites. By the late 6th century, one of these rulers, Yang Jian, seized power in northern Zhou and declared a new dynasty, the Sui. He took the name Emperor Wen of Sui, and though his reign would be short, his impact was massive. In 589 CE, he launched a campaign against the south and successfully crushed the last of the southern dynasties. For the first time in nearly 4 centuries, China was unified again. The Sui dynasty wasn't subtle. It was centralizing and building faster than its own population could breathe. Roads, legal codes, taxes, everything was standardized. The empire's arteries were extended with a titanic project, the Grand Canal, stretching over 1,000 miles. It linked the fertile south to the political and military heartlands of the north. Grain shipments became smoother, troop movements faster. Trade, for once, flowed with more water than blood. But the Sui did not last. Emperor Wen's son, Yang Di, inherited a solid state and nearly destroyed it. Charismatic, refined, and deeply insecure, Yangdi expanded military campaigns on all fronts against the Turks in the north, the Koreans in the east, and even attempted invasions of Vietnam. The campaigns were costly, the victories rare, and the labor demanded from the population unbearable. Millions were drafted to work on walls, roads, and canals. Taxes soared, famine followed. Uprisings erupted like cracks in a dam. By 618 CE, the dam broke. The Sui collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Out of the wreckage rose a new power, less desperate, more calculated. Li Yuan, a Sui general with imperial blood ties, seized the moment. With a combination of battlefield skill, family alliances, and careful diplomacy, he declared a new dynasty, the Tang. And with that, China entered one of its most brilliant golden ages. The Tang dynasty, founded in 618 CE, would become the empire. The future Chinese rulers looked back on with both awe and longing. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world, the vast grid of markets, mansions, temples, embassies, and alleys filled with spices, scrolls, incense, and foreign languages. The Silk Road now terminated not in a dusty caravanserai, but in a metropolis of 1 million people, where Arab traders, Persian scholars, Korean monks, and Central Asian musicians walked the same boulevards. The early Temps emperors moved carefully. They knew the chaos that came from overreach. The first Gaozu ruled briefly, then passed the throne to his son Li Shimin, who became Emperor Taizong, one of China's greatest rulers. Taizong was clever, pragmatic, and occasionally ruthless. He had to be. To secure the throne, he eliminated rival brothers and forced his own father into retirement. But once in power, he ruled with balance and clarity. He lowered taxes, rewarded merit, and listened to criticism. He invited scholars, revived Confucian institutions, and promoted a bureaucratic system that judged officials on ability rather than birth. His court was filled with seasoned advisors and debate. Ministers could and often did criticize the emperor directly. Some were executed, others were promoted. Occasionally both. But this wasn't just an age of governance. It was an age of culture. Tang poetry blossomed into an art form unmatched in its subtlety and elegance. Names like Li Bai and Do Fu emerged poets, whose verses could capture the entire sweep of emotion in 4 lines: joy, grief, longing, or the quiet ache of a cup of wine under a plum blossom tree. Poetry wasn't just for poets. Officials were expected to compose it. Soldiers memorized it. Even illiterate villagers knew a line or two that had floated through the countryside on the wind. Art thrived. Buddhist cave temples were carved deep into cliffs at Dunhuang, filled with frescoes of heavenly bodhisattvas and starry skies. Painting moved from court portraiture to expressive landscapes. Calligraphy was elevated to spiritual discipline, and then there was the court itself, a whirlpool of formality, beauty, gossip, and ambition. Tang China saw the rise of one of the most extraordinary figures in Chinese history, Wu Zixi. Originally a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong, she became the consort, then wife, of his son, Emperor Gozong. When he fell ill, she ruled in his name, then as Empress Dowager, then eventually as emperor in her own right, not empress. Emperor, the only woman to hold the title in Chinese history. Her rule, from 690 to 705 CE, was complex. She was accused of cruelty, of nepotism, of manipulating court factions, but she also promoted capable officials, expanded education, and gave Buddhism state backing. The empire did not collapse under her rule. It prospered. After her death, the Tang continued its upward arc. Under Emperor Xuanzong in the early 8th century, the court became a dazzling spectacle of wealth, ritual, music, and art. It was a time of lovers and lyricism, of lacquered screens and flutes in the moonlight. But decadence has a price. Court politics grew bloated. Eunuchs, concubines, and aristocrats wielded hidden power. One general, in particular, An Lushan, rose through the ranks with charm and cunning. Trusted by the emperor, adored by the court, he eventually led one of the deadliest rebellions in Chinese history. In 755 CE, An Lushan marched on the capital. The emperor fled. The rebellion lasted nearly a decade, resulting in millions of deaths and the near collapse of the dynasty. Though it was eventually suppressed, the Tang would never fully recover. Regional governors began acting independently. Peasant uprisings flared. The imperial court became increasingly reliant on eunuchs and mercenaries. By the late 9th century, famine and war once again tore through the countryside. In 907 CE, the last Temp's emperor was deposed. The dynasty, once shining with silk, ink, and starlight, flickered out. China fractured once again. The next century would be a tangled mess of short-lived states and competing warlords known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. But something had changed. The memory of the Tang remained like a melody in the background, a reminder of what unity could bring, what beauty could be born from order. And in the north, one new dynasty was already waiting, quietly laying the groundwork for a new age. They would rise not with military might, but with scholarship, innovation, and the quiet confidence of scrolls and inkstones. The Song dynasty was almost here. The collapse of the Tang left China fractured once again, but this time the disunity didn't last centuries. It barely lasted a generation. In the north, military governors overthrew one another in rapid succession, each claiming imperial titles that dissolved as quickly as they formed. In the south, regional rulers governed wealthy and relatively peaceful kingdoms, some of them trading silk and ceramics overseas, while pretending not to notice the political chaos to the north. This was the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, short, unstable, and often violent. But amid the instability, a new force emerged. In 960 CE, a general named Xiao Kuangyin, tired of the endless cycle of mutiny and betrayal, convinced or gently pressured his fellow officers to let him take the throne. He didn't conquer, he consolidated, and he named his new dynasty the Song. From the beginning, the Song dynasty took a different approach. Where previous dynasties leaned heavily on military power, the Song emphasized civil governance. Xiao Kuangyin, now Emperor Taizu of Song, understood the danger of overly powerful generals. He removed military authority from provincial commanders and restructured the system to ensure that no one man could easily seize power again. Instead, power would lie in the hands of scholar officials, men chosen through the rigorous and famously difficult imperial examination system. The exam system wasn't new. It had existed in some form since the Sui. But under the Song, it became central to governance. Candidates studied Confucian classics, composed essays, and endured multi-day testing sessions in near isolation. Success meant a prestigious position in the bureaucracy. Failure meant, well, joining the vast population of highly educated, deeply disappointed men across the countryside. This system created a government staffed not by warriors or aristocrats, but by literati men trained in philosophy, poetry, and moral theory. It was meritocratic in theory, though only families wealthy enough to support years of study could realistically participate. Still, it reshaped Chinese society. The song didn't unify all of China, at least not at first. The northern steppes were held by the Khitan Liao dynasty, a powerful nomadic confederation that had established its own state with Chinese-style administration. The song coexisted uneasily with the Liao paying annual tribute to keep the peace, but despite that political concession, the song ruled over a wealthy, stable, and increasingly sophisticated realm. Kaifeng, their capital, became a bustling urban center, filled with markets, restaurants, entertainment quarters, and a population in the hundreds of thousands. It was a city where paper money was used in everyday transactions, where clocks told the time with elaborate waterworks, and where printing presses turned out books faster than anyone could read them. The Song dynasty's technological innovations were extraordinary. Gunpowder, developed in the Temps, now evolved into practical weapons, flamethrowers, bombs, even rudimentary rockets. Printing, too, expanded. The woodblock gave way to movable type. The Song produced maps, encyclopedias, and medical texts in volumes never seen before. Agriculture also surged. The introduction of early repenning rice from Vietnam allowed farmers in the south to harvest multiple times a year, supporting larger populations and increasing food security. Southern China, once considered a backwater compared to the north, became the new economic powerhouse. Trade flourished. Porcelain, with its pure white body and elegant glazes, became a major export. Chinese junks sailed as far as the Persian Gulf and East Africa. In return came spices, horses, and exotic luxuries along with new ideas. But while the economy soared and culture flourished, the military remained a weakness. In the early 12th century, the Song made a risky decision, hoping to defeat the Liao. Once and for all, they allied with a rising nomadic power to the northeast, the Jurchen. It worked. The Jurchen overran the Liao and destroyed their state. But then they turned on the Song. In 1127 CE, the Jurchen captured Kaifeng, kidnapped the emperor and his court, and occupied much of the north. It was one of the most traumatic events in Chinese history, remembered as the Jingkang incident. Thousands were slaughtered or enslaved. The imperial family was humiliated. Paintings and poems from the era are filled with mourning and bitterness. The Song court fled south, eventually establishing a new capital in Hangzhou. This marked the beginning of the Southern Song dynasty. Despite the loss of the north, the Southern Song was resilient. The new capital, built along canals and nestled among green hills, became a cultural and commercial marvel. Hangzhou dazzled visitors. Night markets glowed with lanterns. Its poets wrote about lakeside walks and rain on temple roofs. And its libraries overflowed with printed volumes. But the threat from the north didn't disappear. The Zhou established the Jin dynasty and ruled over northern China with a system that blended steppe traditions and Chinese bureaucracy. The Song and Jin coexisted in wary hostility, sometimes fighting, sometimes trading, always watching. And then, far beyond the Great Wall, another storm gathered. In the vast grasslands of Mongolia, Temujin was uniting the tribes. By 1206, he would be crowned Genghis Khan. The Mongol conquests began with an explosion of speed and violence that the world had never seen. Jin China fell under assault first. Its cities burned and its armies shattered. The Southern Song tried to hold the line. even forming temporary alliances with the Mongols to fight the Jin. But it was a desperate gamble. Once the Jin were gone, the Mongols turned their attention south. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, led the final campaign. It was long, brutal, and marked by both military brilliance and political calculation. The Song resisted for decades. They built powerful navies, fortified cities, tried every possible diplomatic maneuver, but it wasn't enough. In 1279 CE, at the Battle of Yamen, the last Song emperor child was held in the arms of a loyal minister and leapt into the sea rather than surrender. The Song dynasty ended not with surrender, but with drowning. China was now part of something entirely new. For the first time in history, a foreign dynasty would rule all of China. The Mongol Empire had arrived, and its Chinese branch would be called the Yuan dynasty. The Mongol conquest of China wasn't just another regime change, was a revolution in speed, scale, and style. Where previous Chinese dynasties rose slowly, consolidating regional loyalties and managing the balance between court and countryside, the Mongols arrived like a sudden storm, riding in from the north with unstoppable momentum. They came not with ideology, but with horses, arrows, and the confidence of a people who had conquered almost everything they had ever seen. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, was not just a conqueror. He was a strategist, a politician, and a man who understood that to rule China, he couldn't just burn it, he had to become its emperor. In 1271 CE, before the final defeat of the Song, Kublai declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Yuan. He claimed the mandate of heaven, named his new realm after a word that meant origin or primordial, and set up his capital in Dodu, modern-day Beijing. This wasn't a return to Chinese tradition. It was an attempt to redefine what Chinese tradition could include. The Yuan dynasty, 1271 to 1368, ruled over a vast, multicultural empire. Chinese peasants, Mongol elites, Central Asian merchants, Tibetan monks, Persian astronomers, and Venetian travelers all walked the streets of Dodu. Kublai wanted legitimacy, so he adopted Chinese-style governance, the bureaucratic structures, the Confucian rituals, the imperial exams. But he did so selectively. Mongols were placed at the top of the social hierarchy, followed by Central Asians and other non-Han groups. Native Chinese were divided into northerners and southerners, and both were pushed down the social order. High government offices were often filled by non-Han officials, and the civil service, examents, the ladder of social mobility, was suspended for long stretches. It was a hybrid empire, part nomadic, part Buddhist, part Taoist, part Muslim, part Nestorian, Christian. The Mongols promoted trade and valued artisans. They rebuilt roads, protected caravan routes, and revitalized the Silk Road. Foreigners were welcome, especially if they brought skills. The most famous of them, Marco Polo, would later describe the Yuan court with awe, painting Kublai as a benevolent philosopher king and Dadu as a glittering city of splendor. His account was exaggerated, romanticized, and frequently misinformed, but not entirely fictional. The Yuan era saw remarkable scientific and cultural exchanges. Persian doctors introduced new medical techniques. Muslim engineers built astronomical instruments. Art took on new shapes and themes. Theater, especially Zayu drama, thrived in cities. The printing industry exploded with plays, textbooks, and Buddhist scriptures. But, despite this cosmopolitan sheen, the Yuan dynasty was never fully accepted by many of the people it ruled. To the Chinese, the Mongols remained conquerors. Their cultural and political preferences horseback archery, meat-heavy diets, and steppe-inspired fashion were alien. Taxes were high, labor demands were harsh, uprisings simmered just below the surface. Kublai Khan's successors were less capable. After his death in 1294, the dynasty declined rapidly. Court factions grew bitter. Succession disputes destabilized the capital. Famines, floods, and plagues ravaged the countryside. The Mongol military, once agile and devastating, became sluggish and dependent on mercenaries. In the early 14th century, the Yellow River Long, a symbol of both life and destruction, flooded again, devastating the plains and displacing millions. As canals broke and relief failed to arrive, rebel movements began to form. One of the most significant was led by a man named Zhu Yuanzhang. Born into poverty, orphaned by plague, and raised in a Buddhist monastery, Zhu rose through the ranks of a religious-based rebel group called the Red Turbans. Charismatic and calculating, he consolidated power among the anti-Yuan factions. Unlike other rebel leaders, he understood both military logistics and political messaging. He presented himself not just as a general, but as a restorer of order. By 1368, Zhu had marched into Dadu. The Mongols fled north. The Yuan dynasty was over, at least in China. A remnant state, the northern Yuan, would linger in Mongolia, but their rule south of the wall had ended. Zhu declared himself the Hongwu Emperor, founding a new dynasty. The Ming. And so began a new era, one that looked backward and forward at once. Where the Yuan had welcomed outsiders and played with hybridity, the Ming sought restoration, a return to Han Chinese rule, a reassertion of Confucian orthodoxy, a revival of everything the Mongols had disrupted. The trauma of foreign rule had left a mark. The Ming would build walls, literal and symbolic. But within those walls, they would also spark a cultural and economic revival that would echo across the oceans. China was Chinese again, but the world had changed. The Ming dynasty began not with elegance, but with exhaustion. After the fall of the Yuan, the people of China were eager for order. Zhu Yuanzhang, the rebel monk-turned-emperor, gave them that harsh, unrelenting, and deeply personal as the Hongwu Emperor. Zhu established one of the most autocratic regimes in Chinese history. He distrusted scholars, disbanded the prime ministership, and ruled with near-total control. Paranoia was policy. Secret police, known as the Eastern Depot, roamed the streets, rooting out dissent. Officials were punished for corruption, laziness, or having the wrong dreams. Literally, nightmares were sometimes taken as omens of betrayal, and yet, the Ming state he built was strong. The civil service exam was revived and refined. Land was redistributed. Tax systems were standardized. Irrigation projects expanded agriculture, and village registers brought census data under control. The empire was Confucian again, rituals, ranks, robes, and all. After Hongwu, the Ming saw its share of strong and weak rulers, but the dynasty stabilized, then flourished. Its capital shifted from Nanjing to Beijing, where a sprawling new palace complex was built, an imperial city within a city. The Forbidden City, begun under the Yongle Emperor, was a statement of permanence. Red walls, golden roofs, endless courtyards. It wasn't just a residence, it was cosmic architecture, designed to place the emperor at the center of the world. Yongle wasn't content to rule inwardly. In the early 1400s, he commissioned one of the most extraordinary maritime enterprises in history, the voyages of Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch admiral. Zheng He led massive fleets, some with ships over 400 feet long, through Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and even the eastern coast of Africa. He brought gifts, negotiated trade, and collected tribute. These were not voyages of conquest, but demonstrations of power. China was reminding the world who sat at the top of the hierarchy. And then abruptly, the voyages stopped. After Yongle, future emperors viewed the expeditions as costly, wasteful, and ideologically suspicious. The ships were decommissioned, the records archived or destroyed, and China's attention turned inward once more. The Ming preferred isolation to entanglement. Foreign trade was restricted. Maritime travel was limited. This wasn't xenophobia, it was cultural self-preservation. China saw itself as the center of civilization. The outside world was interesting, but ultimately peripheral. Still, China remained a giant in production and culture. Its porcelain, silk, and tea were coveted globally. Silver from the New World, shipped by Spanish merchants through Manila, flooded into Chinese coffers. The empire's internal economy thrived on urban markets, guilds, and craft industries. Meanwhile, literature and philosophy reached new heights. Novels like Journey to the West, Water Margin, and The Plum in the Golden Vase reflected a society both imaginative and bawdy. Paintings captured misty mountains and fragile blossoms. Confucianism fused with Buddhism and Taoism into a refined intellectual stew. But underneath the surface, the foundations began to rot. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Eunuchs gained unchecked influence. The court became increasingly detached from the provinces. Military defenses weakened. The Great Wall, expanded and fortified during the Ming, could not keep out internal decay. In the early 1600s, famine, plague, and rebellion returned. The most serious uprising was led by a former postal worker named Li Zikeng, who swept through the countryside with promises of justice and food. In 1644, he captured Beijing. The last Ming emperor, Chongjin, hanged himself from a tree on the palace grounds. But Li Zikeng would not rule for long in the northeast. Another power had been growing. The Manchus, descendants of the Jurchen tribes, who had once founded the Jin dynasty. They had adopted many Chinese customs, but retained a fierce military culture and a centralized tribal structure. Under their leader, Narachi, and later Hong Taiji, they prepared to seize the vacuum left by the Ming collapse. When Li Zikeng took Beijing, the Ming general guarding the Great Wall, Wu Sangui, made a fateful choice. Rather than submit to the rebels, he opened the gates to the Manchus. The Qing dynasty began. Unlike previous foreign conquerors, the Qing did not rule briefly. They would govern China from 1644 to 1912, nearly 3 centuries. At first, the Qing faced resistance. Loyalist Ming forces held out in the south for decades. But over time, the Manchu rulers cemented their legitimacy. They preserved much of the Ming bureaucracy, promoted Confucian ideals, and took pains to present themselves as rightful bearers of the mandate of heaven. The early Qing emperors were capable and curious. Kangxi, who ruled for over 60 years, was a scholar, warrior, and diplomat. He mastered Chinese classics, patronized science, and kept the empire stable. His grandson, Qianlong, presided over the Qing's peak time of territorial expansion, economic growth, and cultural renaissance. Under their rule, the Qing conquered Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, and pushed deep into Central Asia. The empire now stretched from the Pacific to the steppe, a patchwork of languages, customs, and climates. But the Qing, too, would face the same slow unraveling that haunted every dynasty before them. By the 19th century, the Qing was struggling with internal rebellion and external pressure. Western powers, now technologically superior due to the Industrial Revolution, forced open China's ports through gunboat diplomacy. The Opium Wars, fought against the British in the mid-1800s, humiliated the Qing. Treaties were signed under duress, ceding Hong Kong and granting foreign powers extraterritorial rights. The empire's sovereignty was chipped away, piece by piece. Home rebellion raged. The Taiping Rebellion, 1852-1864, led by a man who believed he was the brother of Jesus, became one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, claiming tens of millions of lives. Later, the Boxer Rebellion would try and fail to expel foreign influence through mysticism and violence. By the end of the 19th century, reformers called for modernization. Some wanted a constitutional monarchy, others demanded revolution. The court hesitated. The Empress Dowager Cixi clung to tradition, funding marble boats and garden pavilions, while the world raced ahead. In 1911, revolution came, led by Sun Yat-sen. A coalition of reformers and military officers overthrew the Qing. The last emperor, Pui, a boy of 6, was removed from the throne in 1912. Over 2,000 years of imperial rule ended not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a signed abdication and a quiet departure from the Forbidden City. The Republic of China was declared. But the China's story was far from over. It would pass through warlords, invasions, revolutions, and reunifications. It would become one of the most complex, contested, and consequential narratives in modern history. But that is another tale, the tale you have followed. The history of Imperial China was one of dynasties, rising and falling like the tides of the Yellow River, of sages and emperors, rebels and generals, poets and pirates, of walls and scrolls, of silence and thunder. A world that dreamt in porcelain and moved in the rhythm of 5,000 years. Now, that world is quiet again. Let it rest. Let your thoughts drift like lanterns on the Yangtze and sleep.